This is Sirens, a new series brought to you by the Ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues, and sometimes lure their men to their deaths. And apparently, we also talk about climate, because while you are listening to this episode, I'm asking you, just take a few minutes, check out our mini episode with Erin Sikorsky on her new book, Climate Change on the Battlefield, which is an awesome exploration of how climate change reshapes military operations and the roles of militaries in responding to the climate crisis. I'm Lauren DeYoung-Schulman.
I'm Erin Simpson.
And I'm Rada Iyengar-Plum.
Speaking of listening, I love when listeners come to me and say, like, hey, I've listened to your podcast. I love your podcast because that's delightful. So definitely tell us that. What I really love is they almost always comment, and I listened to it at 1.0 speed, which I think is meant to be a compliment.
It is. But
yes.
Tell my mom what we mean by that, Lauren.
Like that listening to the speed at which we are actually speaking out loud. I am able to listen to us at 1.75, but that's possibly because I am used to listening to ourselves.
Same.
Well, also, You were there when we said it, so you're really just listening for the flubs. You're not actually trying to hear us.
Yes. I confess when I listen to, there's other podcasts that I listen to at 1.75 that by the end of it, I just have to recognize I definitely learned some vocabulary words in that podcast and maybe not much else. Like I need to go back to 1.5, I think is my takeaway. What do you guys have like a preferred?
Yeah, 1.5. I think between 1.2 to 1.5 is like my zone, depending on the particular conversation and narration.
Jeez. Do you listen to your audiobooks at that speed too?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Oh Christ.
It depends on if there's a really great, like sometimes they get actors to narrate and then I might get like parts of it to do at 1.0, but 1.0 is really slow. I wish I could listen to life at 1.2. I'm going to be totally honest.
You definitely run meetings at 1.2. That's for sure.
Yeah. I'm in virtual meetings sometimes with my hands below the screen, just going like, come on, you can speed up. Like, you know, those little like turtle things on the, on Zoom, you can like show turtle or show rabbit. Like rabbit, you're too fast. Turtle, you're too slow.
Oh, I haven't seen that.
No.
Yes. I've never seen them deployed, but like, can you imagine? But yeah, I'm definitely tempted. All right. Well, speaking of things that are either too fast or too slow, this is probably too fast because we have too many things going on. We want to get through. It's a drill. Oh, actually, no, we're not going to It's a Drill yet. We actually need to ask our question. I got this. Rada mentioned something like this many weeks ago, and it intrigued me. And so I am now very curious about what is the most bizarre news alert or Twitter alert that you have ever set, or which one brings you the most joy?
So let me start this to say, for longtime listeners, they will know I love a good Google alert. I set them for all sorts of things. And I will just bring you the one that brings me the greatest joy, which is my husband. His name is John Plum. There is also an artist, an old English artist by the name of John Plum, who had a series of art publications. And I now have set up a Google alert for when pieces of artwork go on sale by the English painter, John Plum, that I can then track and see, should I ever wish to buy one of these. They're never in my price range, but I will admit that I have shown them to my mother, who is also an art aficionado.
Absolutely.
And we've discussed the potential of getting a John Plum, the English painter artwork. And I give you my fascination with Google alerts.
I love that. That makes me happy that it makes me happy that it is there, and it makes me happy that it exists for you. And that you're able to like bring all of these passions together here, as it were. Erin, what about you?
So Rada's discussion there reminds me of why I probably don't have a lot of Google alerts. And that's because my dad's name is O.J. Simpson. And so basically my desire for like name-based news updates has been pretty well extinguished in my life. So I really don't partake in this particular chicanery.
For a while, so sometimes it usually didn't bring me joy, but every once in a while it did. For a while, I had a Google alert set for best military advice. If you are a civ-mil nerd of a certain vintage, which is not that far away, you will know that we had strong feelings about the use of the term best military advice. I, in particular, had strong feelings about it when At one point in time, the chairman at the time swore to me he would never use it ever again. And after that, I was like, all right, fine, bet. And I set a Google alert just to see how often he or anyone on his staff would use it. And reader, they did quite frequently. So it didn't really bring me joy, just maybe as much like Schadenfreude, I guess, whatever it would be. So kind of sad. So hopefully civ-mil nerds will recognize the reference. Okay, for real this time on It's a Drill. As usual, there's a lot of things we're not going to be able to get to, but we have fortunately previewed to you in other episodes. We continue to go down the path of the various legal and other battles around National Guard deployments in states that don't desire them. We were going to possibly mention the fact that there is a new Japanese prime minister, or likely to be one, but it also seems as though possibly that government is not going to form. TBD. This is now, we're recording on Monday night. And it was also going to be the first woman prime minister of Japan. And that there are this weekend, which again, I'm recording on Monday the 13th, anticipate that there are going to be, once again, large political protests going on throughout the country. And we had a great episode talking about the efficacy of political protests about a month and a half, 2 months ago that we'll re-highlight. But for reals, I have just talked a lot. I want to take a sip of water. So instead of me, I want to go to Aaron to talk about the Gaza deal and what's up with that.
So this is obviously just a kind of a drive-by discussion of this, and my guess will be that we'll either highlight this in a future segment or maybe a mini episode. But as Lauren said, we're recording on Monday, and that means that today Hamas released the remaining 20 living hostages that they had held since the October 7th attacks in 2023. And then there was a large signing ceremony for a ceasefire and sort of subscription or signing on to a broader peace plan between Israel and Palestinians, kind of bringing ostensibly this war that's gone on for the last 2 years to an end. So now we're on to the next couple of phases, which include minor details like disarming Hamas and governing Gaza. That includes a Council of Peace, which may or may not be led by Tony Blair. Very interesting development. And just a flag for our listeners, because it's something that I have not seen a lot of discussion of. There's also meant to be a stability force with participation by Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, and the UAE, as well as up to 200 U.S. troops at a civil military coordination center. So those troops are not at the moment being tagged as peacekeepers per se, but certainly introduction of active duty troops by the United States and a broader international force that's meant to do something to maintain this ceasefire will be very, very interesting to watch.
So we are now on day 13 of a shutdown that going on in the United States government. And I wanted to chat briefly about the recent announcement as of last Friday of reductions in force that were threatened by the Trump administration going into the shutdown. They have estimated that around 4,000 employees will receive layoff notices across 7 different agencies. HHS being the ones going to get the bulk of it, at least as far as we know, as well as education, HUD, energy, treasury, and EPA. Folks may have seen the major announcement at the CDC of reductions in force notices, then that they were later rescinded. This happens a lot in this administration where there are cuts made, people raise their hand and say like, hey, oh, that's a problem. And they're like, oh, oops, we never mind. We didn't mean to do that. But let's take away or forget for a moment where the RIFs are and the numbers that they are being applied to. And just think about the fact that while the administration is saying that RIFs are meant to be targeting wasteful or duplicative activities and to align staffing with its own priorities, this is just fully 1,029,000% against the law. There is no actual statutory justification for layoffs during a shutdown period. There is no belief that HR people doing RIF notices should be doing an exempt activity. This is not a constitutional activity or a constitutionally associated activity. Like presidents don't just have the right to do RIFs whenever they want to. And there's just not any planet in which it makes sense based on the justifications that they have for it, which include things like RIFs are being justified as a way to pay the military, which they will be able to do for one additional pay period. And I'm going to quote somebody who I will not name by name, but this gave me this an amazing reference to like why you would be offering RIFs, which are not saving any money in order to pay for the military. They said, this is like killing someone who is already in a coma because you were worried that they were going to eat the Cheetos in the pantry.
Wow.
I'm not going to further explain that. I just really enjoyed it. Anyway, the RIFs are clearly political, and I would ask folks listening to thinking through what message are they meant to send and to whom. Last but not least, Rada, what's going on?
Yeah, so on a completely different note, there are going to be 100% tariffs on Chinese goods.
What?
So,
Why?
yeah,
How?
right. So the president slash the U.S. government announced that they were going to impose 100% tariffs on Chinese goods. So that basically means everything is going to double its price at the border. In practice, for consumers, that means everything from electronics to clothing. For businesses, huge elements of the supply chain basically are going to face cost increases overnight. So, couple of just notes. One, obviously, there's a complicated economic picture currently with questions on growth and bubbles and accelerating inflation from a range of Chinese dependent supply chain and consumer good activities is probably really questionable. And second, I think there's a bigger, even picture question on whether this is the sort of thing that would generate a full scale economic decoupling between the US and China, which would really reshape economic markets wholesale. I'll just note that Paris Fashion Week was earlier this month and hemlines were noticeably longer. And if I were going to bet on what that means for economic predictions, I would say that we should be a little bit concerned. So it will be interesting to watch what's happening and interesting to watch what comes up in the next week's fashion weeks.
People should know
Rada,
that's an
I was-
actual thing. That's not just something
Yeah.
that Rada made up. That's a real thing.
It really is.
You're welcome.
When I was reading through the notes, I saw that Paris hemlines in parentheses and had one of like, what? What are you? Oh, okay. Yes, this all makes sense now for a variety of reasons. But yes, great reference. Great reference. All right. Well, building off of that miniature fire, we're going to move into some actual dumpster fires, of which we again always had lots and lots of options. So dumpster fires, obviously, what they sound like, things that are both a big deal in the moment, but also a big deal in terms of the role and how they shape, threaten, or otherwise maneuver institutions of American power. And we first wanted to talk about a theme that we have been chatting about in the background for the past couple of months, and that is some new changes in the Russian strategy, both in Ukraine, but also in Eastern Europe, and how NATO and the rest of Europe is responding. So there's a lot to this. So I'll just try to give some highlights here before we get into like, what does this actually mean? In about almost 2 months ago, early August, Russia started ramping up drone and missile attacks inside Ukraine, targeting power grids, infrastructure, and other things like that, most notably ahead of winter. And we'll get back to that. In addition, amongst other things that were going on, about 24 drones entered Polish airspace, which prompted our friends in Warsaw to scramble fighters, activate air defenses, and really notably invoke Article 4 in consultations with NATO. Within days, NATO had put together and launched what they are calling Operation Eastern Sentry, which I'll talk about a little bit more detail in a minute, but think about air patrols, repositioning forces, and making clear that they saw that incursion and other recent events as very purposeful and organized and not just like happenstance that they're going to ignore it. At the same time, Russian fighter jets violated Estonian airspace, not for a long period of time, but over the Gulf of Finland. But like this is their usual like test and learn, test and probe kind of approach that they use. And then, last but not least, a lot more going on in Ukraine over the past several weeks, towards the end of September, beginning of October, with bigger attacks inside Ukraine, as well, both the missiles in Kharkiv, drone strikes on energy depots, as we mentioned, deadly strikes on civilian aid centers, and other things that have had us and others questioning, is this a new phase? Is it just like a fall? We're feeling feisty. What are they actually trying to signal with this? And really interestingly to me in this moment, given where we are in the Trump administration, how is NATO adapting to this? So on that, like, let's ask the big hard questions. Like over the past 2 months, we have seen all of these events between the drone incursion, NATO airspace, the renewed attacks on infrastructure. What do we think? Is this more of the same and it just feels new because we're paying attention to it? Or is it evidence of a major pivot that we're seeing in Russia right now?
So I'd kind of go with somewhere in between. I don't think it's exactly more of the same. The incursions into Polish airspace, the incursions into Estonian airspace, the disruption of airport activity in Denmark and Norway, and several kind of, I don't know, flybys essentially by drones of various locations in Germany, mostly industrial locations there. Um, is a bit of a shift, but I don't know that it's an entirely new strategy. I mean, and we'll kind of get to this, but I think it's pretty consistent with what Vladimir Putin has been looking to do for some time, which is, find fissures, both within the European NATO members and then, of course, between European and the US members themselves. So, I do think that this is different, both in scope and scale. And certainly you're getting a sense from that eastern flank. Why we call it a flank and not a front, I do not understand, and I would love for somebody to mansplain that to me just for once.
I feel like it has to do with butts.
I feel like it has to do with we don't want to say that we're in a conflict with Russia, so it has to be a flank
There's
and
a
not a
Sir
front.
Mix-a-Lot joke in here. And I just couldn't get there fast enough.
Amazing.
I also while we're making like bizarre references, Aaron, when you said that Putin is looking for fishers, my brain heard it as fishers.
Fishermen.
And I was thinking like, okay, what is this new like NatSec strategy thing? Like what's the new hotness here of like
Oh my
fishers that I
gosh.
just like
Yeah.
haven't learned? How can I find this out in the next 10 seconds?
Any hoodle.
I mean, but I will just like going back to Aaron's, I tend to agree. I think the thing that's different is the tolerance for systematic testing of this in a way that before it might have been one off with a lot of space in between incidents. And the scale and the scope matter because it actually lets you get a lot, not to make this all about data, but lets you get a lot of data points here, right? It's a kind of over and over again intentional probing of potential weak spots, and you worry in any vulnerability testing that is the sort of thing that can lead to a breakthrough.
Well,
and I'd say
speaking
that
of,
both the Poles and the folks in the Baltics, right? So Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, um, definitely believe that something different is going on here.
yeah,
So
and we'll get to that in a minute in terms of like who's believing what here, but specifically on the more recent sense, Poland clearly viewed the drone incursion into their airspace as like a WTF over. They tried to trigger Article 4 or did trigger Article 4, and out of that came Eastern Sentry, which let's be clear, has a really cool name. Like the specifics and the overall effectiveness behind it, TBD. But cool names are obviously the primary point of entry here. But more seriously, what does this tell us about? Well, not even just how Poland is viewing its red lines, but given that they receive support here, and how does NATO? How did NATO actually respond here? Not just in terms of like what they're obligated to do, but how they actually substantively responded to this.
I think you see quite a lot of scrambling, both in terms of actual movement of troops and military materiel, as well as a bit of a effort. We have a relatively new Secretary General still within NATO, Mark Rutte, and trying to keep everyone together. And mostly what that usually means, historically that means, the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. What this means is we're still trying to keep the Americans in and the Russians out, but we're also trying to keep a leash on that eastern flank. Right. So we're trying to sort of do some sort of escalation management among folks who feel very threatened. We should again share that land border with Russia. I think it's also, and again, I said before that this was, part and parcel of some longer term, Russian approaches. I thought I could live forever without hearing gray zone activity or hybrid war, which I even wrote a paper about in 2006. But like, did not need to come back to any of that language.
When you were a child, obviously.
I was a child,
A prescient
obviously.
child.
And but this is classic, right? So they're definitely trying to do a certain amount of activity for whatever set of purposes, and we'll get to that, below a retaliatory threshold. In the Cold War, this was called the stability instability paradox. So the two superpowers would be, kind of deterred from major conflict, but there was lots of things going on lower. I think that's still what's happening here, and the question being kind of why or to what end is Russia doing this?
Yeah.
But I think NATO is not flummoxed. I mean, they've been oriented to this threat now for several years, but I don't know that they know like what the appropriate or the useful or the strategic response actually is.
There's just an extra complication because we have more domains now, right? Like there's like, and so the addition of those domains, the kind of shift in norms, I can't tell, I'm certainly not an expert on these things, how much the Eastern flank wants the threshold to be lower than Moscow thinks to trigger the sort of, major states in NATO, and how much, what the stability equilibrium looks like here.
So just to put a fine point on it, of like, what do we think Russia, based on like the testing that we're talking about here, what do we think Russia is actually trying to pursue? Because they are not, at least in this moment, all the events we're talking about here, like that does not seem to be gaining them or trying to gain them territorial gains. What is it that they're actually aiming for in this series of events that we've just been talking about?
I'm going to test I have kind of three theories of the case. Aaron probably has a more robust, but I think it's roughly in order of like the warfighting Maslow hierarchy. One is just like pure resource prioritization. Like, hey, don't send your stuff to Ukraine. I could attack you here too. Like, keep your missiles and Patriot batteries and whatever at home. I think the second is, I don't know, intelligence collection isn't exactly right, but like what would response or marshaling response look like in these different places? And can we get a sense of it? And I think the biggest one is this alliance stress testing that we've been talking about, which is how far can I go with who before someone gets really cross at me?
Yeah, I mean, I think
they do, because Rada talks about people getting cross.
Vexed, they'll be quite vexed. I think that those are all plausible hypotheses, Rada. I guess for whatever set of reasons, I'm sort of currently leaning toward the intel and probing, both from a kind of policy question and who's really going to show up for these sorts of things, but also from just a capabilities piece. What actually does it look like when you light up these air defenses? What kinds of defenses do you have at civilian infrastructure like airports? I mean, I just feel like there's definitely some sort of intel collection, probing being done by this. But there's no doubt that the broader piece of all of that is in service of creating chasms, if not fissures, Lauren, between various NATO members, both on the continent and in the transatlantic, piece of that. And so, finding ways for France to be annoyed at the polls, or the UK to not support the Danes, or any of those things are in service of Russian political aims. And I think that one thing that is it comes up again, I feel like there is sort of a perception among some members that the eastern flank really is kind of the boy who cried wolf, and the eastern flank is just 100% certain that these salami slicing tactics do not stop here. And they have just hundreds of years of history to kind of back that up. And so they're very much like, if you don't do something, and I would agree that they don't have a lot of, meat behind the something, but this will not be the end of it. And that's really, I think, kind of the political challenge within the alliance and for those countries on the eastern flank.
So pulling some of these threads together, the Trump administration, since he first came into office, has not been shy about their views about how Europe needs to pull much more of its weight from a security perspective, though he's been kind of going back and forth on that weirdly over the past.
Are we sending tomahawks to Ukraine? Like, I don't know. I have lost the plot here. I don't even know what's going on.
I can't even like thematically try to pull all of that together, but that has at least been a thread that has been going on. And then in addition to maybe sending tomahawks, TBD, in addition to our friends in Europe having to adapt to all of these actions by the Russians over the past several months, how would you grade their homework to date? Grade their being NATO sans United States, our European allies. What should they be pursuing in addition or instead that helps them with any kind of credible deterrence? Or are they, I mean, as far as we can tell, doing the best that they can?
I think they are not doing the best that they can. Maybe I'll start there.
Rada, you want to think so positively of them. I can tell.
I know. It's really, so here's the thing. the US apparatus is often slow, but when faced with a pressing challenge, we basically can step up and do really miraculous things. And I guess I'm waiting for that European moment that is like, yes, we are together and we are going to do all the things and Russia doesn't stand a chance. And right now I think there is some rhetoric in that direction, though not as wide as you might like. But I think it lacks the visibility and credibility that would need to be there for it to be sufficiently credible to halt it. And you see that it is not, because you see Russia continuing to do things. So I guess my feeling is it is directionally correct, but insufficient.
I'd maybe add some nuance to that in terms of I think the polls are doing a lot. Like if you
Yep.
just in
Fair.
terms of like money spent, willingness to upset allies, NATO allies and partners by buying South Korean kit, for example, because it was available. By which I mean the South Koreans were willing to basically allow the Poles to buy out of stock, and where as opposed to waiting 3 more years for U.S. HIMARS. So there's definitely kind of a sense of urgency, budget activity, and even procurements going on in Poland that are kind of putting your money where your mouth is. The Germans ostensibly had this, moment, Rada, 3 years ago, the Zeitenwende, with but not fully, right? I mean, there's a lot of money kind of associated with this turn, but we haven't seen that translate into dramatic procurements or new capabilities. There's definitely some, but there's just a lot more to go. I guess I would highlight the Brits as kind of not in the EU, but still in NATO, which has given them kind of an interesting place. They've definitely leaned in on the Ukraine piece, but less clear what that means in terms of their behaviors and procurements vis-a-vis Russia. Again, they're trying to, play a larger global game, even though they're increasingly realizing that what they need to do is really focus on Russia. So they might still get there, but they've got some size, frankly, challenges. They've got two mini aircraft carriers and F-35Bs that are basically going to bankrupt them. So there's some challenges with that piece. The one thing that I think is kind of interesting, that we've seen from the EU in the last few weeks is this idea of a drone wall, and that will have, which I can't even. But the problem is that
Sounds
drone,
cool.
it's just the aerial version of counter IED efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Drones are very cheap. They're basically flying lawnmowers. And air defense is always expensive. You need sensors, you need precision, you need radars to detect them. We don't even know where all these things are being launched from. It's not like they're coming directly from Russia, with a several 100-mile approach vector. So the idea that you're going to be able to effectively defend everything from 100 some odd random drones is a genuinely hard and expensive problem, and that sucks.
Final question here, and this is an impossible question to phrase as a sentence, but I'll do my best. We've been commenting somewhat throughout that Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and the United States, and then NATO as a body all have different, I guess I would say red lines, but like, and that's a perfectly fine thing, but also just like motives towards additional bigger action, as Rada mentioned earlier. In my mind, I thought of like the giant that is waking up and suddenly getting into gear. So, what is and like, you both have worked on this problem set in different ways over the last decade or so. Like, what do you anticipate given the Trump factor, new dynamics in Western Eastern Europe, uh, circumstances in Ukraine? Do you see any opportunity for like better alignment between those three to four actors there over the next coming months, and like what would pull them down to having better and closer red lines? Not better red lines, closer red lines. Or are we just going to be in the same mess in a year and having the same conversation in a year about like, what are we in a new phase of the war now? And because of the same sort of actions we're talking about right now.
So there's a kind of cat called a Fisher cat.
I love this. I love you pulling all of that together. Thank you.
Here you are. And their sort of claim to fame, they're not really a cat. I think they're like a weasel or a mongoose or something. Anyway, but they eat porcupines.
Sure.
Here's the gist of this.
Wow.
Yep.
And the way they go after the porcupine is through soft spots that don't have quills.
Uh-huh.
So I give you this analogy to say Russia is trying to figure out where are the soft spots that don't have quills for NATO, and
Yep.
can you accept the gentle probing to find, or the not so gentle probing, but not lethal probing to find those soft spots, or are you going to get your quills into it first? And that, I think, is where we are. And the question, to my mind, is really not so much is Russia preparing for war with NATO, or what that means, but are we, to the earlier Aaron's earlier point on the salami slices, are we accepting this new normal of these salami slices of incremental activity that mean we will end up getting eaten by the Fisher cat before we have a chance to get the quills out? And that, I think, is the dynamic.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that Russia is playing from a place of strength here.
Yeah.
And I recall, in a slightly earlier life, when I was focused much more on things going on in Syria, the Turks actually shot down a Russian jet that intruded on Turkish airspace in like 2014 or 2015. So I guess I'm, snidely or snarkily, I would say I'm just waiting for them to piss off the Finns, and the Finns will take care of this problem. More broadly, I do think that there needs to be some better kind of retribution, what that maybe accept some risk on the escalation ladder, I guess, is kind
Yeah.
of what I would say, because I don't think, to Rada's point, and sort of to escalation dominance theory more generally, like hitting cooperate repeatedly does not necessarily guarantee you a good outcome on the escalation ladder. And I can even see, I mean, if you could sort of imagine like a world of headlines where, there's an intrusion, Poles or somebody on Eastern Century, shoots down, whether it's drones or an actually manned, platform. And then everybody sort of waits. And Donald Trump is basically like, sweet, love that, love to see
Yeah.
it, and then, you sort of play out. I think it's very difficult to anticipate what President Trump would do vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis escalation in that space, because he's just really gone back and forth on Ukraine policy, for example. But I do think that he does seem to favor toughness. And so to the extent you can imagine a certain set of actors playing to that desire for toughness, you could see a way of keeping some of those players together. Whether that keeps all the NATO players together is another question.
I'm just imagining them all doing one more blitz on the Oval Office again, and all coming. Maybe I'll do karaoke that night. Hard to say. Okay, speaking of themes of attacks that we have been noticing changes in, this one I will tell you was slightly reassuring to me, because I feel like I've been noticing it vaguely in the background, and when I actually started digging into it, realized, oh yeah, there are some differences here. I did actually see a trend here that's very validating, since I had not really been paying attention, and that is around cyber attacks. We have been talking about, like, is there actually anything new going on in the space of cyber attacks over the past couple months, such that we should talk about it on Sirens? Not necessarily because of size, but the question of, is there something actually qualitatively different going on? Couple of examples. There's lots and lots more. I'm going to mispronounce all of these. Japan's Asahi Group, which is a beer production, they had to halt beer production after a ransomware attack. Contests confirmed that hackers had leaked some personal data of more than 1 million customers after an initial breach via Salesforce. Major European airports had check-in and boarding outages tied to a service provider compromise. Jaguar Land Rover had to shut down production as well after cyber incidents. We've heard about zero-day exploits with Oracle, ransomware halting operations at Bridgestone, and then our friends at CISA, how we said this now, they recently issued a warning of new Iranian-linked attacks, cyber campaigns against critical infrastructure. So lots of things going on there, but we want to spend a little bit of time pulling out the thread on what those had in common or didn't, and is there anything actually new about them, and whether or not there's some commonality in who's behind them. So I will start first with that big question of, like, what is actually genuinely new here? Is it more? Is it different? Is it both? all of the above. So Rada, why don't I start with you?
It's interesting doing this after the Russia-Ukraine conversation because much like Erin's opening comment, it's a difference in scale and scope.
Yep.
If I could steal her words.
Yes.
So I think volume-wise, you just attacks are just way up.
Yep.
I think that is coupled with a sophistication and in particular these what I'll call advanced persistent threats and zero-day exploits or probing very early on for system vulnerabilities. And they're also shifting from front end, like let's say folks will remember a couple of years ago, NHS exploits, right? Front end folks that are intersecting with the customers to back end underlying infrastructure, like your sales infrastructure, finance infrastructure. Um, and that's in part because the goals are not just extractive or breaking through encryption. They're actually things like disruptive or disruption in actual operations to generate enough damage to let them have the leverage for whatever it is they want to do. So I think both the sophistication of the attacks and the magnitude of what they're going after have increased, which makes them different, but of a type.
Which is an interesting, we'll pull this start in a second. It's an interesting thing to think about in terms of the who, both in terms of are more actors and what is it they're actually aiming for by shifting their models here, because the disruption thing was one thing that really caught my eye here. So but with that, I think given that like none of us are ourselves cyber analysts, but we all sort of noticed different things going on here. I want to pull the thread a little bit on what actually made some of these incidents stand out. We've already mentioned one, and that was around disruption being a goal, or at least one of the outcomes of this. We mentioned like the disruption both at airports, but also in some factories that had to like fully shut down, rather than being things that were trying to steal data and sell it on the black market or in the dark web in some way. But what else that came out of this that folks noticed in terms of overall trends that are, if not necessarily wholly different, that like differently shifts in trends or leans of difference in the nature of the attacks?
I think one thing that stuck out to me as I was kind of reading through some of the reporting on this is the degree to which you basically have ransomware as a service, right?
Yeah.
And so you have this is essentially, stationary bandit problem from economics, right? You have companies that have complex operations and they have various digital infrastructure that enables those operations, and those then have third party software and entry points, associated with them. And so if you want to just like, make a quick $10 million, you can hold, Land Rover or Asahi beer, hostage, until they pay the ransom to unlock their systems again. Marks and Spencer also had an issue with this kind of earlier
Oh yeah,
in
that's right. I forgot about that one.
2025, which was around, which basically just meant that they couldn't sell stuff anymore. And so I think, maybe there's two pieces of that. One is that these entry points are a little bit different in terms of being more this third party kind of operational software that
Mhm.
enables sales and logistics tracking and management of factories. And then two, just the straight, what we'd like to do here is is just for you to give us a lot of money so that you can get back to business. Whether those could then be used for more strategic aims or whether it's, state actors have more nefarious, questions around that. So there's clearly a capability around, yeah, this is actually not that difficult to do. And with various AI enablements, we can do it at scale. And so, you pay us this amount of money and we'll set the ransom at this. And it's like, just exchanging money for goods and services.
And with
It
Salesforce
really brings
and
me back to the
Oracle,
like terrorist days of like what's a criminal gang,
Yeah.
what's a
Hmm.
terrorist,
mhm.
how centralized or decentralized are they? So to my mind, like things that are interesting are that there are uh, the tools for cyber attacks have been democratized with AI.
Wow, I've never heard that language
So
before.
you have that. But then you have these much more like I would call them closer to gangs than even really criminal enterprises, like
Yeah.
gangs that, to Aaron's point, have this kind of cyber attacks at scale. And then you can have state and varying degrees of state sponsorship for those gang related activities. So the operating environment, the market for this just looks a lot thicker than it used to. There are more diversified actors and more different ways to support those actors and more different ways those actors can act.
And they, based on both what we are seeing, but also what you're describing, Rada, they have different or growing incentives around their own reputations, by wanting to make splashier things or wanting to, like, they're trying to make an impression with their own reputation
They're
in a
trying to
way
get
that,
market
like,
share.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I think, like, gangs is almost the, like, best analogy, which
Mhm.
is they wanna have their blocks and their neighborhood and their turf that they are seeking and protecting rents on, and that just looks really different than the thugs for hire model from thugs for hire or directly paid for in a giant room, state-sponsored work you might have seen
Well,
before.
I think it'll be interesting then to see whether any of these organizations offer defensive services, right? Because that
Yeah.
is the flip side of the gang model, right? You are
Yep.
ostensibly supposed to get some form of protection for their rent-seeking
Protection out of it.
behavior.
You both have already touched on this a bit, but just to go down the path of when I heard Oracle and Salesforce, my immediate thought was like, wow, all right, so they've struck Oracle and Salesforce when it came to the European airports and some other players, but like that's also a huge number of also other possible targets as associated with their clients. So would love to hear more about your thoughts on the playbook that is coming with that sort of vector of attack.
Yeah, I mean, I think this dimension of attacking big service providers and software vendors,
Mhm.
like third party logistics folks, that's a really different dimension. You could see it from the attacker perspective, right? Which
Yep.
is if you can get in on those vendors, your scale of your impact is just way bigger. So I think the European airport outages show that. But it also, like, they have deep pockets, right? So you're robbing the bank because that's where the money is.
Exactly.
So we've seen this. We heard about the stories about Marks and Spencer disruption. I'd totally forgotten about that. The airport disruptions. There's obviously some corporate impacts if plants are shut down for days or weeks at a time. But is there a bigger story than that? Particularly as it relates to ones that may lean more into nation statey or having specific informational or strategic aims beyond just this sort of thing. How does that fit in?
Yeah, I mean, we started this on the Russia side, and so let me just kick off this piece by saying I think this is a place where I don't really understand what deterrence could or should look like,
Yeah.
and especially when it's hard to make attributions, even if you have attributions for a group, then you have open questions on whether it is connected to a state actor or not, and then you have the attacks on private actors rather than the government. It's like I don't know, my non-political science brain starts like fritzing.
Well, my pseudo economist brain just says it's the same talent pool, right? I think it's the
Yep.
same humans who are doing a lot of these things in terms of specialization,
Uh-huh.
and who they're getting paid for or why they're being asked to do it kind of varies, but it's in some ways not strictly material to the outcome. I do think that there was a really good kind of little series from The Economist earlier this year called Scam Inc., which captured a different version of this, which are the like have you guys also got like, the dozens of different like text messages, which are clearly either like for jobs or just like
Mhm.
hello, and they're like trying to like build rapport. Like that is part of a
Yep.
much broader, also kind of AI enabled attack surface to lure people in and sort of become various forms of the social engineering that goes into a lot of these attacks. So, I mean, I have no doubt that there's a strong state-based interest in a lot of these things. You saw a spike in the Israel Iran context when that war was hotter earlier this year. A lot of Iranian activity, but it's like not just that, and clearly there's also room for if you can manipulate the information space along with this. There's an attack on Marks and Spencer. Well, who do we blame that on? Does somebody have an
Yep.
incentive to create a narrative around what's happened there? So whether you want to call that false flag or disinformation or other sorts of muckraking, there's a lot of room for manipulation that comes with these disruptions, especially of kind of like large national brands.
So, just to close out, pulling us back like a boring professor onto the topic of institutions of American power, this is all going on at a point in time where United States cybersecurity infrastructure is not exactly at a higher ebb. Folks may remember probationary employee firings at DHS earlier in the year, as well as potential reduction in force at some of the agencies that are responsible for protecting critical infrastructure. We're in the middle of a shutdown, so a lot of the folks who should, in theory, be working on this are either not working or working without pay, which, believe me, creates great morale. Lots of top talent in government who, even when they have jobs, are thinking about leaving government for the private sector, which does not necessarily mean they're going into the same sort of security or protective roles. And with budget uncertainty that we're facing right now and inconsistent funding hampering anything you might want to think about doing about this longer term, we're in a moment where we're seeing these trends happening. Hopefully, US government is seeing them as well, and they are on 7 or 8 back feet in terms of their ability to respond. But beyond including and beyond that, what as we talked through these various events and the trends that we're seeing this, like, what is it we think that we bigger picture for American power and influence?
Yeah, I think, if I were going to work my way from big to small, or from small to big, I would say there are these big critical vulnerabilities we have. We typically think of critical infrastructure in things like energy, but increasingly our digital backbone is part of that. And we got to figure out a way to shore that up. But I think bigger picture, this fits in with this question of like, we're keeping talent out with H1 with changes in H1B and visa status, making it harder for international students to come. And at the same time, we need American companies to protect their data and operations. And that seems like a losing battle. And even bigger picture, if we think this digital market is the place of the future where a lot of innovation in software and AI is going to live, the complete and total inability to protect it from outside actors and adversaries is going to be a problem. And we need a different and better solution to that than what we're looking at right now.
And I guess I have kind of a twofold piece here. One, we highlighted some of the challenges that DHS, Department of Homeland Security, has had, and they really are the kind of lead domestic cybersecurity organization. But there's also intense dysfunction at the FBI. And that's where you would actually go if you were trying to prosecute domestically anyway. But also, the FBI provides a lot of support to overseas investigations, and my guess is that this is not high on their priority list right now, and that's unfortunate. Similarly, we got a lot going on in Congress, or not that much going on in Congress if you're in the House and you've been out of session for 2 weeks. But we're not going to get any domestic legislation that really sets standards for the amount of protections that companies should have for your personal data, or really create an environment where they might have, instead of waiting for the market to solve that problem, are instead required to have certain sets of protections. um, those are sort of two small things. More broadly, and this I think kind of gets to the discussion we were having on Russia, and that Rada has highlighted. This is just part of a growing pattern of increased uncertainty for a variety of global actors, right? So we have policy uncertainty in terms of like whether the United States will, increase tariffs by 100% at the drop of a hat, or support foreign partners. We have geostrategic uncertainty, and now like for companies, you have just like operational uncertainty. You don't know if you're going to be able to run your factory or manage your supply chain or like issue invoices, on a regular basis. That's really frustrating. And so the money that you would spend to, defend against that is money that could be spent on capital investments or innovation, or, human capital and raises or training or other ways that you would otherwise improve the company. So it's not that it's per se a dead weight loss, but it does kind of create this almost protection racket, sort of, piece to things that doesn't deliver a lot of benefit either to shareholders or to, probably consumers at the end of the day. Cheery, heartwarming.
Well, that I think we've given our listeners quite a bit to think about for this, and now we're going to move into an interview that gives them even more so to think about.
And now it's time for warning signs. Today we have with us Laura Dickinson. Laura is the Lyle T. Alverson Professor of Law at the George Washington University Law School. Hi, Laura. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Prior to her work at the GW Law School, Laura was actually special counsel to the general counsel at DOD and served as a senior advisor at the State Department. And earlier in her career, she was a Supreme Court clerk. So she's a wonderful person to help explain some of these issues that we want to talk about today. This segment sort of first started when we were looking at the Supreme Court ruling, or at least announcement around the president's pocket rescissions of foreign aid and kind of what the spending powers and the role of the executive there might be. But we quickly realized that this was part of a larger story around separation of powers. And as Laura very well knows, and certainly our listeners probably do too, national security has always been a tricky area for the judicial and legislative branches. But we've also seen the Trump administration rely on emergency powers for everything from tariffs to National Guard deployments. So this question around the role of the executive, whether there's any restrictions on the executive, is really back to the forefront for many of us. So we want to use this discussion to talk about the continuation of this trend and recent executive actions and the court response, and also thinking about how we calibrate those authorities when national security is invoked for nearly everything. So, with all that said, Laura, let's start with the big picture. If you were meeting your 2023 self or even your 2015 self, tell us the story of maybe how separation of powers have shifted and what in the last 9 months you would really pay attention to.
I would note that due to shifts on the Supreme Court, we've seen the rise of a new theory of broad executive power called the Unitary executive theory that's really shaping a lot of outcomes in judicial decisions. And this theory holds that the executive branch has quite significant power in relation to the other branches of government, Congress and the courts, and that the president wields sweeping authority within the executive branch. And I think this theory is, in fact, uh, fueling what we might call power grabs by the current president. And more specifically, right, the theory relies on this idea that the vesting clause of Article 2 of the Constitution says that all executive power shall be vested in the president. So the idea is that all executive power means that everyone within the executive branch must be directly accountable to the president. And the Congress can't create through so called independent agencies or civil service protections limits on the president's ability to hire, fire, or directly supervise anyone in the executive branch. Um, and
I guess that's really interesting, and I hadn't heard it framed in quite that way before. Is that related then, as we sort of think about the Trump administration specifically, to this invocation of national emergencies, or the reliance on maybe that theory or other clauses for things like tariffs and other activities?
Yes. But even before we get to national security, which, as you point out, has been a place where the courts have exercised deference to the president historically, not unlimited deference, but deference. Um, this theory of the unitary executive is reshaping executive power more broadly. So, even apart from national security, this administration is relying on that theory to do all sorts of things that in the past we would have thought of as flatly unlawful. So, for example, President Trump has fired the heads of agencies that federal law says can only be fired for cause. He's fired thousands of federal workers, including workers who are protected by statutory civil service protections.
Mhm.
He's terminated tens of billions in grants and contracts. He's claimed the power to reallocate or not spend funds that are specifically designated by Congress. And that arguably violates Article 1's spending clause that gives Congress the power to allocate money, and Article 2's take care clause, which provides that the executive must take care care that the law be faithfully executed. He's worked to virtually eliminate entire agencies such as USAID, and he's also imposed tariffs unilaterally without Congress. So all of these things encroach on, if not trample, the powers of Congress. And the unitary executive theory is fueling this. And this sort of adds to this historical deference that the president gets in general when the president is exercising national security powers.
As you're
So I
telling the
guess
story, I am thinking of how on earth, as a law professor, you or any others who are actually teaching law to law students at this point in time, how on earth you are managing to describe both what is supposed to happen versus what is actually happening right now, and how to grapple with that in real time. And like the way you just described it, like we've been talking about these issues over the course of the podcast, but all in one package is just an absolutely monumental change from where we were even several years ago, but even where we were in January, frankly. Out of the things that have happened in that last 9 months, are there any court rulings or events that specifically caught your eye that were particularly game changing or opened up doors much, much wider than they had been before, either in the national security space as we were talking about, or more broadly?
Yeah, so even going back before this administration, I would point to a case called Sela Law, in which the Supreme Court said that the president has the authority to hire and fire at will the head of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, despite a statute that mandated that the head could only be removed for cause. So that case, I think, sets the stage for this broad theory of executive power, the unitary executive theory. Another case that was really important was the decision that President Trump had immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts. And although that case wasn't directly about the unitary executive theory, there's language in that decision that expresses the view that the president has to have a lot of power, has to be unfettered by concerns that decisions could lead to criminal prosecution outside. If once the president is outside of office. So I think the backdrop of those cases, even before this administration came into office, is really important. And this goes way beyond national security, but obviously it has added importance in the national security space. Now, there's some more recent cases I'm happy to talk about that have been coming up given the actions of this administration.
Yeah, I think we'd certainly be interested in hearing more about that. The new term has, just begun, I think, last week. And there have been a lot of cases come up, I guess, through the shadow docket, which I'll be honest, if I knew about it, I hadn't paid a lot of attention to it previously. But it sounds like those are places where the court has given essentially expedited interim rulings. And maybe you can tell us, Laura, whether those cases will now come back for full hearings at some point if they're on the docket for the fall or the spring. But definitely interested in kind of what you've seen in the last few months that continue this trend, or maybe
Yeah,
push back against it. I don't know if there's been examples where the court has given some pause.
there are a few, but in general, the court has been really siding with this administration. So there's been a lot of litigation because the actions of this administration are really pushing at the edges, or perhaps pushing across long-standing understandings of what is lawful on the part of the government. And so a lot of the lower courts have been issuing what we call stays or injunctions of actions that the government is taking based on the idea there's a likelihood that these cases will succeed on the merits. So sort of preliminary rulings. And those rulings have been going up to the Supreme Court. Um, and the court has been sort of issuing very terse decisions without much explanation. And this is often called, the shadow docket, because the court doesn't ask for briefing, doesn't get oral argument, doesn't get the benefit of deliberation, serious deliberation, and they're just ruling really quickly. They don't have to do that. They could just decide to leave those lower decisions in place. But this court is not doing that. They are reaching out and they are undoing the injunctions that the lower courts are issuing in these terse rulings and cryptic rulings. And they're often ruling for the executive branch, often on what I might call proceduralist grounds. So they're not necessarily getting to the substance of the claims, but they're making these proceduralist rulings. So let me give some examples. So they're saying in a lot of cases that the people who are suing most likely don't have standing to sue. They're saying with respect to the massive terminations of contracts and grants that these cases can't be brought in the federal courts in the first instance. They have to go to a court called the Court of Federal Claims, which is where you sue on contracts related to agreements between you and the federal government. With respect to the cases about firings of workers, they're saying, no, you can't go into federal court in the first instance. You have to go to this other body, the Merit Systems Protection Board. They're saying some of these cases are not ripe. It's not the time to bring them up. They're saying in some of these cases that there's no cause of action to sue. So, for example, in the case challenging the cutoff of funds to USAID, challenging this as an unconstitutional rescission, as an unconstitutional act by the executive branch, interfering with Congress's appropriation power. The court is saying, at least on this emergency docket, as a preliminary matter, that there doesn't seem to be a cause of action in this litigation for the suit. In the case that's challenging birthright citizenship, which seems to be a pretty clear mandate in the US Constitution, they're saying that a court can't issue a nationwide injunction blocking this. Instead, you have to sue in each separate district on each specific case. There are also some pretty significant rulings on substantive matters as a preliminary matter that I'm happy to go into as well, that have where the Supreme Court has sided with the executive branch.
Let's hold that. Listeners, please check back later this week for our full interview with Laura Dickinson.
Okay, Gong Show this week. We in our last Gong Show we did a surprise deep dive into Robert Redford, and I'm feeling saddened that we are doing a sort of repeat theme this week of doing a deep dive into Diane Keaton. We could probably just do a similar thing again, where we talk about like what's our overall takeaway on Diane Keaton and our favorite movies.
Rada, what I want to know is if you were ever an Annie Hall girly. You're the only New Yorker here. And
No.
La-di-da does not really summarize your existence for the most part.
Yeah. I mean, I love the First Wives Club. Love.
I do love the First Wives Club. Yes.
So, but Annie, Woody never did it for me.
Yeah. You're better off.
A little too cynical for you, I think.
Yeah.
Are you more of a something's gotta give, or what's the other one? The one with Jack Nicholson.
That is the one with Jack Nicholson.
Wait, no, there's another one, isn't there?
No.
Okay, no. Oh my gosh, I can never remember any of the names. Baby Boom. I'm thinking of Baby Boom, which is not Jack Nicholson. That's Sam Shepard.
Oh, I haven't seen Baby Boom. So I would say I like Something's Gotta Give. I like the First Wives Club. There was that book club where they're in it's called Book Club.
It's called Book Club, yes.
With her and Murphy Brown, but that's not her
Candace
real name.
Bergen.
Yep. And Jane Fonda, and they read 50 Shades of Grey, and that's a great.
I definitely missed that.
I love Something's Gotta Give for a lot of reasons, but I'll mention two. One is her house in the Hamptons,
For sure.
which is delightful. And then 2 is Keanu Reeves is just like gung ho over Diane Keaton, and that just feels like right with the world. Like, of course, Keanu Reeves would be totally just batshit over Diane Keaton. Like, that's just amazing, and he plays it beautifully.
I mean, we were discussing Baby Boom earlier this week, and that's a movie that my sister and I watched dozens of times. And like the politics of Baby Boom, which is a very like late 80s movie, are so bizarre. I would love for our younger listeners to go back and watch that and see just like how they can parse any of the things that are happening. But Diane Keaton like never got married, didn't have children that we are aware of.
Nope.
Retained a sort of signature style for several decades, after winning multiple Academy Awards in the 70s, right? Like it is just a sort of perfect public existence. I love her in The Godfather. The
Yeah.
foil of kind of both her naivete, but then in Godfather 2, the way that crumbles, and that she has to become as cynical as the rest of the family. It's really both an incredible set of performances and just like a fascinating life and career amongst all of these other kind of larger than life figures. So it's her sense of self, I think, really persisted through all of that, and that's relatively unusual in Hollywood.
I somehow had forgotten that she was in The Godfather, even though I was just reading about this earlier today, because she she is not playing the Diane Keaton character
No,
in
no.
that one. And it's not to say that she's like one note. That's not it at all. It's more that she is unable to hide like just her sort of joie de vivre in most of her other roles. But in Godfather, it's very different. And actually, a lot of the other '80s movies is quite different as well, like Reds and some of the other ones. Looking for Mr. Goodbar, also fascinating in terms of the politics of it. People who haven't watched '80s movies should just go back and like test that out.
Well, in
See how
80s
they-
movies with like, 70s directors, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Reds is the passion project. I mean,
Yes.
it's a whole thing.
I will just say that if you're a modern take on this is The Family Stone,
Oh
in
yeah,
which she is the mom to a variety of sons, and Sarah Jessica Parker is just truly a horrific guest in her home. And I think, it's a holiday movie that I probably need to bookend with more uplifting ones
Well,
from
I
the
would never
Hallmark
need to
Channel,
watch
but
that
it's
movie
solidly in
again.
the
I saw it in
rotations.
theaters and I'm good. Like it's
the frittata scene is basically scarred on me for the rest of my life. I can't even make frittata. No, is it frittata or something else? Whatever it is, the egg dish she makes. God, I'm gonna have to have another Manhattan just to get
No,
through the
thank
evening
you.
now.
No, thank you.
All right. Well, I meant to remind you of this before, but please do us all a very lovely favor and leave us a rating or a review or both on Apple or Spotify. And if process is your Valentine, and I know it is because you're all the way at the end of this episode, please share an episode with a friend. Thanks.
Thanks.